The rain had not stopped for 3 days. Maisie pressed her back against the stone wall of the servants' corridor, her thin wool dress soaked through to the skin. Water dripped from the hem onto the flagstones beneath her bare feet. She had lost her shoes somewhere between the second kitchen and the east wing, torn from her by one of the older maids who decided an Omega did not deserve leather soles. She did not fight back. She never did. The castle of Ashenmoor was the largest stronghold in the Northern Territories, a fortress of black granite and iron that had housed the Wolven kings for 11 generations. Its towers clawed at the gray sky like the fingers of something buried alive. Inside, the halls smelled of wood smoke and old stone, of tallow candles and dried herbs hung from the rafters. It was a place built for power, not for someone like her. Maisie was 23 years old, small-boned, with dark auburn hair that fell past her shoulders in tangled waves. Her eyes were the color of rain, a pale, shifting gray that seemed too large for her thin face. She had arrived at Ashenmoor 6 weeks ago, purchased from a debt auction in the border village of Crest Hollow. The price had been 4 silver coins. She had watched the transaction from behind a wooden post, her wrists still raw from the rope. 4 silver coins. That was her worth. Now she worked in the lower kitchens, scrubbing pots with sand and ash until her fingers cracked and bled. She carried water from the well before dawn. She mopped the corridors after the warriors tracked mud and blood through them. She ate whatever was left, usually cold porridge or stale bread, standing in the corner where no one would notice her. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in the wolf hierarchy. No pack, no family, no wolf spirit strong enough to shift. In the world of the Ashenmoor wolves, she was barely a person. But tonight, something was different. The screaming started just past the 3rd bell. Maisie heard it from the linen closet where she had been folding sheets by candlelight. A sharp, piercing wail that cut through the silence of the sleeping castle like a blade through cloth. Then another voice joined the first. Higher, more desperate. Children. She froze, the sheet still warm in her hands. The sound came from above, from the royal wing, where no servant was permitted after sundown. The older maids had warned her on her first night. You go up there, they'll take your hands. The Alpha King doesn't want anyone near his pups. The Alpha King. Even his name was spoken in whispers. Lord Kalen Voss, ruler of the Northern Territories, commander of the Ashenmoor war packs, and the most feared wolf alive. They said he had killed his own brother in single combat. They said his wolf form was black as a moonless night, and twice the size of any natural beast. They said his mate had died 2 years ago, and that since her death, something inside him had turned to iron and frost. He had 2 children, twins, a boy and a girl, barely 4 years old. Maisie had never seen them. No one in the lower staff had. The screaming grew louder. Maisie set down the sheet, her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct told her to stay where she was, to press herself into the shadows and pretend she heard nothing. That was how you survived in a place like this. You made yourself invisible. You swallowed your voice. You did not exist. But the children kept screaming. And something inside her, something deeper than fear, deeper than rank, deeper than the wolf she could barely feel, pulled her toward the stairs. She climbed barefoot, her wet dress clinging to her legs. The stone steps were cold enough to sting. The royal wing was dark, lit only by a few dying torches that threw long, shaking shadows across the walls. Tapestries hung between the doors, depicting hunts and battles in faded thread. The air smelled different here, of cedar and something heavier, something wild, alpha scent. It clung to every surface like a warning. The screaming was coming from the 3rd door on the left. Maisie stood before it, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling at her sides. She could feel the vibration of the children's distress through the wood, raw, animal fear. They were not hurt, she realized. They were terrified. There was a difference. Pain had a sharper edge. This was the sound of small creatures lost in the dark with no one to hold them. She pushed the door open. The nursery was large and cold. The fire had gone out hours ago. Nothing but gray ash in the hearth. The windows were shuttered against the storm, but rain leaked through the cracks, pooling on the stone sill. Two small beds sat against the far wall, carved from dark oak and draped in furs that had been kicked to the floor. The boy was standing in his bed, his small fists clenched, tears streaming down his red face. His dark hair stuck to his forehead. The girl was curled in a ball in hers, shaking, her face buried in a pillow that was soaked through. No nurse. No guard. No one. Maisie crossed the room without thinking. She knelt between the two beds and reached for the boy first, not grabbing, just placing her hand gently on his back. He flinched. Then he looked at her with wide, dark eyes that were so much like the descriptions she had heard of his father that her stomach turned. "It's all right," she whispered. Her voice was barely a sound. Soft, steady, like the voice she used to calm the stable horses when thunder rolled. "You're safe. I'm here." The boy stared at her. His lip trembled. "The dark," he said. The dark came inside. Maisie looked at the dead hearth. Then she looked at the girl, who had not lifted her face from the pillow. She was still shaking. "What's your name?" Maisie asked the boy gently. "Rowan," he whispered. "And your sister?" "Alara. She doesn't talk anymore. Not since Mama went away." Something cracked inside Maisie's chest. She had felt that kind of silence before. The kind that came after a loss too big for words. She had lived inside it for years. She stood, found the tinderbox on the mantel, and knelt before the hearth. The wood was damp, but there was dry kindling in the basket beside it. She worked quickly, her cracked fingers steady despite the cold. Within minutes, a small flame caught, then grew, then filled the room with a warm, golden glow. The shadows retreated. Maisie returned to the beds. She picked up the fallen furs and draped one over Alara, tucking it gently around her small shoulders. The girl did not look up, but her shaking slowed. Then Maisie sat on the floor between the two beds, her back against the stone wall, and began to hum. It was not a proper song. It was something her own mother had hummed to her before the sickness took her. A melody without words, low and warm, like firelight turned to sound. She did not even know its name, but it lived in her bones, and it came out now without permission. Rowan watched her. His fists slowly unclenched. He sat down in his bed, then lay down, pulling the fur to his chin. His eyes stayed on her face, as if he was afraid she would vanish if he looked away. Ilara's breathing evened. Her small hand crept out from under the fur and hung over the edge of the bed. Maisie took it gently. The girl's fingers curled around hers and held on with a strength that surprised her. Maisie kept humming. The fire crackled. The rain drummed against the shutters. She did not hear the door open behind her. Kalen Voss had not slept in 2 days. He stood in the doorway of the nursery, his hand still on the iron handle, and stared at the scene before him. His chest was heaving. He had run from his study at the far end of the wing when the sentry's hound had barked at movement on the stairs. He had expected a threat, an intruder. An assassin sent by one of the southern packs who had been circling his territory like vultures since Nessa's death. What he found was a girl. A small, barefoot, soaking wet girl sitting on the cold stone floor between his children's beds, holding his daughter's hand and humming a lullaby, while the fire she had built cast warmth across the room. Rowan was asleep. His son, who had not slept through a single night in 7 months, was asleep, his face peaceful, his breathing deep. Alara was still awake, but barely. Her eyes were half closed, and she was holding the stranger's hand as if it were the only anchor left in the world. Kalen's wolf surged inside him. A violent, territorial roar that demanded he rip this unknown creature away from his pups, that he bare his teeth and assert dominance and destroy whatever dared to breach the boundary of his family. But his human mind, the part of him that Nessa had always said was better than the beast, saw something else. He saw a girl with cracked hands and bare feet, and a dress too thin for the cold. He saw an Omega. He could smell the faint rain-washed scent of her rank from the doorway. He saw someone who had walked into a place where she could be killed for trespassing, because 2 children were screaming and no one else came. The girl turned her head. She saw him, and every drop of color drained from her face. She released Alara's hand and scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping on her own dress. Her gray eyes were enormous with terror. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. only a small, broken sound, like a bird caught in a wire. Kalen stepped into the room. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, hard-jawed, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of black iron. He wore no crown. He did not need one. Authority lived in the way he moved, in the weight of his presence, in the silence that followed him like a shadow. He looked at the fire, then at Rowan, sleeping. Then at Alara, whose eyes had opened again and were now fixed on the Omega girl, with something Kalen had not seen in his daughter's face in 2 years. Recognition. Not of the girl herself, but of something the girl carried, gentleness. Kalen looked at the Omega. She was trembling so hard he could hear her teeth clicking together. "Who sent you?" His voice was low, rough, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than his throat. "No one, my lord." The words were barely a whisper. "I heard them crying. I'm sorry. I'll go. Please, I'll go." She moved toward the door, but Alara made a sound, a small, sharp whimper, the first sound Kalen had heard from his daughter in months, and her hand reached out toward the retreating girl, fingers grasping at the air. Kalen's heart stopped. He looked at his daughter. Then at the Omega, who had frozen mid-step, her face white, tears beginning to slide silently down her cheeks. Not from the cold, but from the certainty that she was about to be punished for the first kind thing she had done in this castle. "Stay," Kalen said. The word fell between them like a stone into still water. Maisie turned back. She blinked. "My lord?" "Sit down. Stay until she sleeps." It was not a request, but it was not a command in the way she had expected. Not sharp, not cruel. It was the voice of a man who had just seen something he did not understand, and who was not yet ready to let it disappear. Maisie returned to the floor between the beds. Her legs were shaking so badly she nearly collapsed. She took Alara's outstretched hand again, and the girl's fingers closed around hers. Within minutes, the child's eyes drifted shut. Kalen stood in the doorway for a long time, watching. The fire threw his shadow across the room, massive, dark, consuming. But he did not enter further. He simply watched this strange, trembling Omega girl hold his daughter's hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Then he turned and disappeared into the dark corridor without another word. And Maisie sat on that cold stone floor, her heart hammering, her hand still wrapped around a sleeping child's fingers, and wondered if she had just been saved or condemned. Morning came gray and heavy, the rain finally thinning to a fine mist that clung to the castle walls like a second skin. Maisie woke with her neck stiff and her back aching against the cold stone. For a moment she did not know where she was, and then she felt the small hand still curled inside hers, and everything came rushing back. Alara was asleep, her dark hair fanned across the pillow, her face soft and untroubled. Rowan had turned in his bed during the night, and now lay sideways, one arm dangling over the edge, his mouth slightly open. The fire had burned down to embers, but still gave off a faint warmth. Maisie carefully freed her hand from Alara's grip and stood. Every muscle protested. She smoothed her dress, still damp, now wrinkled beyond repair, and pushed her tangled hair behind her ears. She needed to leave before anyone found her here. The lower kitchen staff would have noticed her absence. There would be questions. Punishments. She made it 3 steps toward the door before it opened. The woman who entered was tall and sharp-featured, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a severe knot at the base of her skull. She wore a dark blue dress trimmed with gray fur at the collar and cuffs, and her boots were polished leather that clicked against the stone with military precision. Her eyes, pale green, cold as river ice, swept the room and landed on Maisie like an arrow finding its mark. "What?" the woman said quietly. "Are you doing in this room?" Maisie's stomach dropped. The children were crying, my lady. I only came to—" "You are a kitchen servant." It was not a question. The woman's nostrils flared slightly, reading her scent, her rank, her place. "An Omega. From the lower staff." "Yes, my lady. And you entered the royal wing without permission, and placed yourself beside the Alpha King's children." Each word landed like a slap. Maisie lowered her eyes to the floor. Her hands were shaking again. "I meant no harm. I only heard them screaming, and no one was here because the night nurse fell ill, and the replacement did not arrive. The woman's voice was precise, clipped, each syllable weighed and measured. That is a staffing failure. It is not an invitation for a debt-bonded Omega to wander into the royal nursery. Maisie said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had learned long ago that explanations were worthless currency when you had no power. Look at me. She raised her eyes. The woman studied her face with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite curiosity, something between the two, like a blade being tested against a stone. My name is Dorothea Voss. I am the Alpha King's aunt and the steward of this household. Every servant in Ashenmore answers to me. She paused. Including you. Yes, my lady. Dorothea's gaze moved to the sleeping children. Something shifted in her expression. A flicker, quickly buried, like light passing behind frosted glass. She looked at Alara's hand, still outstretched toward the place where Maisie had been sitting, fingers slightly curled as if holding a ghost. The king spoke to me this morning, Dorothea said. Her tone had changed, not softer, but more careful, as if she were handling something fragile. He has made a decision regarding you. Maisie's blood went cold. My lady, please. I will accept any punishment. I only ask. You are being reassigned. Dorothea cut her off. Effective immediately. You will serve as the children's attendant. You will sleep in the adjoining chamber. You will be responsible for their care from dusk until dawn. The words hung in the air. Maisie stared at her, certain she had misheard. What? Do not make me repeat myself. Dorothea's eyes narrowed. And do not mistake this for kindness. The king does not make decisions from kindness. He makes them from necessity. His daughter has not allowed anyone to touch her in 7 months. Last night she held your hand, a pause, heavy with something unspoken. He noticed. Maisie opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at Alara, still sleeping, still peaceful, her small chest rising and falling beneath the fur. You will bathe and be given proper clothing, Dorothea continued. You will eat with the household staff, not the kitchen workers. You will not discuss the children with anyone outside this wing. And you will remember, every moment of every day, that you are here because the Alpha King permits it. That permission can be revoked at any time for any reason. Am I clear? Yes, my lady. Dorothea studied her for one more long, measuring moment. Then she turned and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. The boy's name is Rowan. The girl is Ilara. Rowan has nightmares about fire. Do not light more than a small hearth flame in his presence. Ilara does not speak. She has not spoken since her mother's death. Another pause. If you hurt them, there is no corner of this world where you will be safe. Do you understand? I understand. Dorothea left. The door closed behind her with a sound like a verdict. Maisie stood alone in the nursery, barefoot on cold stone, and felt the entire axis of her life shift beneath her feet. Chapter 3. Small hands, heavy crowns. The first week was the hardest, not because of the children, though they were difficult in their own ways, but because of everything else. The whispers, the stares, the careful, calculated cruelty of those who had been above her and now found her occupying a space they believed she had no right to hold. The household staff ate in a long hall adjacent to the main kitchen, at wooden tables scarred by decades of use. The room smelled of bread and salted meat, and the sharp tang of ale. When Maisie entered on her first morning wearing the simple gray dress Dorothea had provided, clean, fitted, with proper leather shoes, the conversation did not stop. It simply changed pitch, dropping to a hiss she could feel on her skin. She sat at the end of the nearest bench. No one moved to make room. Heard the little Omega crawled into the king's wing. Someone murmured behind her, a woman's voice, sweet and poisoned. Funny how that works, isn't it? One night near the royal beds, and suddenly you're not scrubbing pots anymore. Maisie kept her eyes on her plate. Bread, cheese, an apple. More food than she had been given in a single sitting since arriving at Ashenmore. Must have quite the talent, another voice added. Male, amused, for someone with no wolf, She certainly knows how to climb. The laughter was quiet, but sharp. Maisie ate without tasting, swallowed without chewing, and left as soon as she could without drawing more attention. The children were easier. Rowan was cautious but curious. He watched her from the corners of rooms, asked questions in short bursts, and then retreated into silence as if testing whether she would chase him. She didn't. She answered when spoken to, offered food and warmth and space, and waited. By the third day, he was sitting beside her during meals, telling her about the wooden soldiers his mother had carved for him, each one painted with the colors of a different wolf pack. "This one's the Northern Guard," he said, holding up a figure with a blue cloak. "And this one's the Shadow Fangs. They're the scariest. Papa says they eat their enemies." "Do you believe that?" Maisie asked, sorting through a basket of clean linens. Rowan considered this with the gravity of a small general weighing battlefield intelligence. "Maybe not the whole enemy. Maybe just an arm." Maisie bit back a smile. "That seems reasonable." Ilara was different. The girl moved through the world like someone walking through water, slow, deliberate, always slightly removed from what was happening around her. She did not speak. She did not play with the wooden soldiers or the rag dolls arranged on the shelf above her bed. She ate when food was placed in front of her, dressed when clothes were laid out, and followed Maisie from room to room, with a silent watchfulness that was both heartbreaking and unnerving. But she reached for Maisie's hand. Every night, without fail, when the candles were blown out and the fire was banked low, Ilara's small fingers would find hers in the dark, and she would hold on until sleep took her. Maisie began to learn the rhythms of the royal wing. The guards changed at dawn and dusk. Dorothea visited every morning to inspect the nursery with the precision of a general reviewing troops. The cook's boy brought meals on a wooden tray 3 times a day, always the same boy, a gangly youth with red ears who never met her eyes, and the Alpha King was a ghost. She did not see him, not at meals, not in the corridors, not in the nursery. She heard him. Heavy footsteps in the hall past midnight, the distant sound of a door closing, sometimes a voice giving orders in a low tone she could not decipher. His scent was everywhere, woven into the stone and wood of the wing like smoke into fabric. Cedar and iron and something darker. Something that made her wolf, faint as it was, press itself flat against the floor of her chest in submission. But he did not come. Part of her was relieved. The memory of him standing in the doorway that first night, the sheer size of him, the weight of his presence, the way the shadows had bent around him as if they were afraid too, still made her pulse stutter. He was not a man you wanted to be noticed by. Not if you were smart, not if you wanted to survive, but another part of her, a smaller part she tried to ignore, wondered why he had told her to stay, why he had reassigned her instead of punishing her. Why a man who reportedly cared for nothing since his mate's death had stood in that doorway and watched an Omega girl hold his daughter's hand, with something in his eyes that she could not name. It was not until the 9th night that she saw him again. The storm returned without warning. One moment the sky was merely gray. The next, the wind came howling off the northern mountains like a living thing, bringing sleet and darkness with it. The shutters of the nursery rattled in their frames. Rowan woke first, sitting bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide. "It's just wind," Maisie said, crossing to his bed. She sat on the edge and placed a hand on his arm. "Listen, it sounds like a wolf howling, doesn't it? But it's only the air finding its way through the cracks." "The cracks should be fixed," Rowan said firmly. "I agree completely. We should write a letter of complaint." He almost smiled. Almost. Ilara did not wake, but she stirred, pulling the furs tighter around herself. Maisie checked the fire, added another log from the stack beside the hearth, and returned to Rowan's side. She began to hum, the same melody from that first night, the one without words, the one that lived in her bones. She was midway through the 2nd verse when a sound from the corridor made her stop. Not footsteps, not the wind. A low, rough sound, ragged breathing, like someone fighting to pull air through a crushed throat. Then a thud, heavy and deliberate, as if something large had leaned its full weight against the wall outside the nursery door. Rowan's hand found her sleeve. "What is that?" "Stay here," Maisie whispered. "Under the furs. "Don't move." She crossed to the door and opened it slowly. The corridor was dark, save for a single torch guttering in its bracket. And beneath that torch, slumped against the wall with his head bowed and his hands pressed flat against the stone, was Kalen Voss. He was not dressed for court or command. He wore only a loose linen shirt, untucked, and dark trousers. His feet were bare. His hair hung in his face, and his hands, his broad, scarred hands, were trembling. Maisie smelled it before she understood it. Blood. Not fresh wound blood, but something older, deeper. The ghost of it, carried on his skin like a memory that would not wash away. And beneath the blood, the sharp, acrid bite of grief. It rolled off him in waves, thick enough to choke on. He was not hurt. He was drowning. She should have closed the door. She should have retreated into the nursery, gathered the children, and pretended she had seen nothing. That was what survival demanded. That was what every Omega instinct screamed at her to do. Instead, she said, "My lord?" Kalen's head snapped up. His eyes were not human. They were gold, bright, burning, wolf gold, and they fixed on her with an intensity that stopped her breath. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. He was holding himself together by force of will alone, and that will was cracking. "Go back inside," he said. The words were barely recognizable, deep, distorted, pushed through a throat that was halfway between man and beast. "Close the door." "You're in pain," Maisie said. She did not know where the words came from. She did not know where the courage came from. Perhaps it was not courage at all. Perhaps it was just the same thing that had pulled her up those stairs 9 nights ago. The inability to hear suffering and walk away. Kalen's gold eyes widened. For a single, suspended moment, something broke through the wall he had built around himself. Something raw and bewildered and desperately human. He looked at her as if no one had said those words to him in a very long time. Then the wall slammed back into place. "I said go back inside." This time she obeyed. She stepped back into the nursery and closed the door with trembling hands. She stood with her palms flat against the wood and listened as his breathing slowly, painfully, steadied on the other side. Rowan was sitting up in bed, watching her with his father's dark eyes. "Was it Papa?" he asked quietly. Maisie hesitated. Then she nodded. Rowan pulled his fur up to his chin and stared at the ceiling. "He comes here sometimes," the boy said, his voice small and matter-of-fact in the way only children can manage when speaking about terrible things. "He stands outside the door, but he never comes in." Maisie returned to the space between the beds and sank to the floor. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt it in her teeth. A king who stood outside his own children's door in the dark, shaking, unable to enter. A daughter who had not spoken since her mother's death. A son who knew his father's grief by the sound of his breathing through a wall. What had happened in this family, and why? Why, in every fractured corner of this broken house, did she feel as if she'd been meant to find it? 2 weeks passed, and Maisie learned to read Ashimore the way a sailor reads the sea, by its silences, its shifts, its hidden currents. She learned that Dorothea's morning inspections were not truly about the nursery. The older woman lingered at the doorway each time, watching Alara with a hunger she tried to disguise as efficiency. Once, when Alara had fallen asleep on the rug before the hearth with her head resting against Maisie's knee, Dorothea had stood in the corridor for a full minute before entering, and when she did, her voice was rougher than usual, her instructions clipped shorter, as if something had lodged in her throat that she refused to acknowledge. She learned that the cook's boy, whose name was Hadley, was terrified of the royal wing not because of the king, but because of the king's war captain, a wolf named Brennan who patrolled the upper corridors at night in his shifted form, gray-furred and enormous, with eyes like molten copper. Hadley left the meal trays on a table at the base of the stairs and fled. Maisie carried them up herself. She learned that the staff's cruelty had a source, and that source had a name. Vivian. Vivian Hale was the head of the household attendants, a position just below Dorothea's, which she occupied with the self-assurance of someone who believed the natural order had made an error in placing her second. She was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, sharp, gleaming, designed to cut. Tall, with wheat gold hair and eyes the color of polished amber, she carried herself through the castle, as if the stones existed to support her footsteps. She was a beta of high birth. Her family had served the Voss bloodline for generations, and she had been raised inside Ashenmoor's walls since childhood. She knew every corridor, every servant, every secret passage, and she had been, by all accounts, deeply devoted to the late queen, or rather, deeply devoted to the late queen's position. The whispers reached Maisie through Hadley, who had developed the cautious habit of lingering a few moments longer at the stairway table each morning. He spoke to her the way one might speak to a stray animal one was secretly feeding, quickly, nervously, with frequent glances over his shoulder. Lady Vivian expected to be appointed the children's guardian, Hadley murmured one morning, setting down a tray of porridge and stewed apples. After the queen died, she assumed it. She moved into the nursery wing for 3 months, oversaw everything, chose the nurses, the tutors, the food. What happened? Maisie asked. Hadley's red ears turned redder. Alara wouldn't stop screaming, not the nightmares, daytime screaming, whenever Lady Vivian entered the room. Rowan bit her. Twice. He paused. The king removed her from the nursery. She hasn't forgiven him, or anyone who stands where she believes she should be. Maisie understood then. The whispers in the servants' hall, the poisoned comments about her rank, the way her clean laundry appeared each morning with small tears along the seams, none of it was random. It was directed, orchestrated. A campaign of slow erosion, designed to make her feel so unwelcome that she would break and flee. She did not flee, but she began to watch Vivian, the way one watches a shadow that moves when nothing else does. The first true shift came on a cold afternoon in the castle's inner courtyard. Maisie had taken the children outside for the first time, a decision that had required 3 days of cautious negotiation with Dorothea, who treated the request as if Maisie had proposed marching the royal heirs into enemy territory. The courtyard was enclosed by high stone walls, sheltered from the worst of the wind, and paved with flagstones that were cracked but clean. A bare apple tree stood in the center, its branches dark and skeletal against the white sky. Rowan ran immediately to a pile of wooden practice swords left by the squires and began conducting an elaborate battle against invisible enemies. His war cries echoed off the walls with the unself-conscious ferocity of a 4-year-old who has no doubt that he is the greatest warrior in the world. Alara stood beside Maisie, holding her hand, watching her brother with an expression that was difficult to read, not quite envy, not quite amusement, something older than both. Would you like to play too? Maisie asked. Alara did not respond, but she let go of Maisie's hand and walked, slowly, deliberately, to the base of the apple tree. She sat down on the cold stone beneath it, pulled her wool cloak around herself, and tilted her head back to look up through the empty branches. Maisie let her be. She had learned that Alara's silences were not absences. They were a language of their own, one spoken in gestures and glances, and the careful calibration of distance. The girl was not empty. She was full of something she could not release. It was while Maisie was watching Alara that she felt it. A gaze. Heavy, deliberate, pressing against the back of her neck like a hand laid flat. She turned. The window was high on the eastern wall of the keep, a narrow archer's slit that overlooked the courtyard. And standing in it, barely visible in the shadows, was Kaelin. He was watching his children. No. He was watching his children with her. There was a difference, and Maisie felt it in the way a prey animal feels the quality of a predator's attention. He was not simply observing. He was studying, measuring, trying to understand something that did not fit the patterns he knew. Their eyes met across the distance. Maisie did not look away. She should have. Every rule of rank and survival demanded it. But something held her gaze steady. Perhaps it was the memory of him in the corridor, shaking, unable to enter his own children's room. Perhaps it was the knowledge that a man who could not touch his own grief was watching from a window, because it was the closest he could allow himself to come. He moved back from the window. The shadows swallowed him. Maisie turned back to the children and found Alara looking at her. The girl's gray eyes, so like Maisie's own she realized with a small shock, were fixed on her face with an intensity that did not belong to a 4-year-old. Then Alara reached up toward the lowest branch of the apple tree. Her small fingers closed around a single leaf that had survived the autumn, brown and brittle, and clinging to the wood with stubborn determination. She pulled it free, examined it, and then stood and walked to Maisie. She held out the leaf. Maisie knelt and took it. "Thank you, Alara." The girl looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back to the tree, and Maisie pressed the dry leaf between her palms and felt, absurdly, as if she had been given something precious. Chapter 5. The Fang and the Flame. Brennan found her that evening. She was in the small linen room adjoining the nursery, folding the children's clothes by candlelight, when the door opened without a knock. The man who entered was everything the war stories suggested: tall, broad, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who did not believe in gentle curves. His hair was iron gray despite his age, which Maisie guessed at no more than 35. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pale against his weathered skin. He wore leather and chainmail even indoors, as if the concept of rest was an insult to his profession. His eyes swept the room, catalogued its contents and its single occupant, and dismissed both as beneath his concern. Then he spoke. "You're the Omega." "Yes." "The one who walked into the royal nursery uninvited." "Yes." "The one the king has placed beside his children." Brennan's voice carried the particular contempt of a man who had spent his life measuring worth by strength and finding most of the world deficient. An Omega with no pack, no bloodline, and no wolf worth naming. Maisie set down the small shirt she was folding. Her hands were steady, though her pulse was not. "If you've come to tell me I don't belong here, you should know the line forms to the left, and the weight is considerable." Something flickered in Brennan's granite face. Surprise, perhaps, or the faintest involuntary twitch of amusement, quickly killed. "I am the king's war captain and the sworn guardian of his house," Brennan said. "It is my responsibility to know every person who stands within arm's reach of the royal blood. So I will ask you once, and you will answer truthfully, because I will know if you lie." He stepped closer. "Who are you? Where do you come from? And why did you enter that room?" Maisie met his eyes. "Copper," she noted, like the wolf Hadley had described. "My name is Maisie. I was sold from Crest Hollow 6 weeks ago. I entered the room because the children were screaming and no one came." She paused. "That is the truth. All of it." Brennan studied her. The silence stretched. She could feel his wolf pressing against hers, a vast, disciplined presence testing her defenses, searching for deception, for hidden intention, for anything that did not belong. He found nothing. She knew this because his expression shifted, not softening, never softening, but recalibrating. The suspicion did not leave his eyes, but it was joined by something else. Reluctant acknowledgement. "The last person the king trusted with his children," Brennan said quietly, "was their mother. She died in this castle, in a room 30 paces from where you now stand. She was poisoned." The word landed like a stone in still water. Maisie felt the ripples spread through her chest. "Poisoned," she repeated. "Slowly, over weeks. Something in her food, her drink. We never found the source. The healers could not save her. The king could not save her." Brennan's jaw tightened. "He has not been the same since. The children have not been the same since. And the person responsible was never found." Maisie's mind raced. "You think it was someone inside the castle?" "I know it was someone inside the castle. Ashenmoor's walls are warded. No outside poison could pass the threshold without triggering the boundary stones." His copper eyes bore into hers. "Which means the person who killed the queen is still here, still walking these halls, still breathing the same air as those children." The candle flame trembled. Maisie realized her hands were gripping the edge of the folding table. "So understand this," Brennan continued, his voice dropping to a register that was almost a growl. "I do not trust you. I do not trust anyone, but the king has placed you here, and I follow the king. If you serve those children well, I will protect you as I protect them. If you betray them, if you are part of whatever poison still moves through this house, I will end you myself, and I will not lose sleep." He turned and left. The door closed. The candle steadied. Maisie stood alone, her mind churning. The queen had been poisoned. The killer was still in Ashenmoor. And someone had placed her, a powerless Omega with no allies and no protection, directly at the center of a murdered woman's legacy. She thought of Vivian, of the whispers, of the way the woman watched the nursery wing with eyes that burned with something far hotter than jealousy. She thought of Kaelin, standing outside his children's door, shaking with a grief that had no end. And she thought of Alara, holding out a single brown leaf, as if it were a key to something neither of them could yet name. The second time Kaelin came to the nursery, Maisie was ready. Not prepared. One could not prepare for the presence of the Alpha King in a small room at midnight, but aware. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, recognized the weight and rhythm of them, and did not startle when the door opened. The children were asleep. The fire was low. Maisie was sitting in the wooden chair beside Alara's bed, a piece of mending in her lap, one of Rowan's shirts, torn at the shoulder during his courtyard campaigns. Kaelin entered slowly, as if crossing a boundary that cost him something. He looked at the children first, always the children first. His dark eyes moved from Rowan to Alara, checking, confirming, cataloging each breath. Then he looked at Maisie. "You spoke to Brennan," he said. "He spoke to me, my lord. There is a difference." The faintest movement at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The memory of one perhaps buried under years of grief. "He told me. He said you were either brave or foolish. What do you think?" "I think you are sitting in a dead woman's chair, mending a dead woman's son's shirt, and you are asking the dead woman's husband what he thinks of your courage." His voice was low, steady, but somewhere underneath it, something stirred. "I think you are either the most dangerous person in this castle or the most necessary." Maisie's needle paused. "Can I not be neither?" "No." Kaelin moved to Rowan's bed and stood over his son. His hand rose, slowly, as if fighting against invisible chains, and hovered above the boy's dark hair. He did not touch him. His fingers trembled in the air, inches from contact, and then withdrew. Maisie watched this, and the ache in her chest was so sudden and so sharp that she had to press her lips together to keep silent. "He looks like his mother," Kaelin said, still staring down at his son. "When I look at him, I see her face, and Alara." His voice fractured. He stopped, breathed, rebuilt. "Alara has her voice. Had. The same voice. And now she is silent, and it is as if Nessa has died twice." The name fell into the room like a coin dropped into a well, spinning, catching light, then disappearing into depths that could not be measured. "Your wife," Maisie said softly. "My mate." The correction was immediate and absolute. "She was my mate, my bonded, the other half of my soul." He turned from the bed and faced Maisie. His eyes were black iron again, but behind the metal, something burned, and someone in my own house killed her while I slept in the next room. Maisie held his gaze. She saw it now. Not just the grief, but the guilt. A guilt so vast it had consumed everything else, leaving behind only duty and rage and the hollow performance of kingship. "The children need you," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. Quiet, steady, carrying a weight she had not intended. Kaelin's expression hardened. "The children need to be safe. That is what I provide. I have given them walls and guards, and now—" He gestured toward her, a sharp movement. "Now I have given them you. That is enough." "It is not enough," Maisie said. "And you know it." The silence that followed was absolute. Kaelin stared at her. No one spoke to the Alpha King this way. She could see the knowledge of that fact moving through him. The shock, the fury, the instinctive dominance response that demanded submission. But beneath all of it, in the deepest part of his eyes, she saw something else. Relief. The relief of a man who had been drowning in silence and had finally heard another voice. He left without answering. The door closed softly behind him. And Maisie sat in the dead woman's chair, holding the dead woman's son's torn shirt, and understood that she was no longer just caring for two broken children. She was standing at the edge of a broken king's grief, and she had no idea how deep the fall would be. Autumn surrendered to winter without ceremony. The world outside Ashenmoor's walls turned white and brutal, the northern winds carrying ice that clung to the battlements like crystal armor. Inside, the castle contracted. Fires burned higher, doors stayed shut, and the corridors smelled of wool and smoke and the heavy musk of wolves pressing closer together against the cold. Maisie had been in the nursery for 5 weeks now, and the children were changing. Rowan talked constantly. He told her about his wooden soldiers, about the hawks that nested in the East Tower, about the time he had tried to follow his father into the War Council and been carried out by Brennan under one arm like a sack of grain. He asked her questions with the relentless persistence of a child who had been starving for someone to answer them. Why is snow cold? Why do wolves have 2 forms? Why doesn't Papa eat with us? Can you teach me to build a fire like you did that first night? She answered everything. She taught him to stack kindling in a pyramid, to blow gently on the ember until it caught, to feed the flame slowly so it would not choke. He took to the task with fierce concentration, his small hands careful, his dark eyes reflecting the growing light. Mama used to build the fire, he said one evening, watching the flames take hold. She said fire was the first gift the old wolves gave to humans, so we would not be afraid of the dark. Maisie knelt beside him. That's a beautiful story. Do you think it's true? I think the best stories don't need to be true. They just need to be needed. Rowan considered this. Then he nodded, satisfied, and returned to his soldiers. Alara's changes were quieter but deeper. She still did not speak, but her silences had shifted in texture, from the dense, airless silence of grief to something more watchful, more present. She began to draw. Maisie had found a piece of charcoal and a stack of parchment in a storeroom, and one afternoon she placed them on the nursery table without comment. Alara sat down, picked up the charcoal, and began. The drawings were remarkable, not in skill. She was 4, and her lines were shaky and imprecise, but in what they contained. Trees with branches that reached like arms, a castle with windows that looked like eyes, a woman with long dark hair standing in a field of flowers, and wolves, always wolves, running, sleeping, howling at moons that Alara drew as perfect circles, the one shape her small hand could master. Maisie pinned each drawing to the nursery wall with small iron tacks. By the end of the 2nd week, the cold stone was covered in charcoal worlds, and the room felt less like a prison and more like a place where someone small was trying, desperately, to rebuild what had been taken from her. It was Alara's drawings that revealed the first crack in the surface of Ashenmoor's buried secrets. Maisie found the drawing on a Tuesday morning, tucked beneath Alara's pillow as if hidden. It was different from the others, darker, more urgent. The charcoal pressed so hard it had torn through the parchment in places. It showed a figure standing over a table. The figure was tall, with long hair, drawn as sharp, angular lines, and something in its hand. A cup. And beside the cup, another figure, smaller, lying flat, still. The shape of the still figure was round at the belly. Maisie stared at the drawing for a long time. Her skin prickled with cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. A figure offering a cup, a pregnant woman lying still. Alara had been 2 when her mother died. Too young to understand, but not too young to see. Maisie's hands were shaking when she folded the drawing and tucked it inside the pocket of her dress. She needed to think. She needed to be careful. If this drawing meant what she feared it meant, if a child had witnessed something that no one else had seen, then the danger was not abstract. It was present, breathing, walking the same corridors she walked. She thought of Brennan's words, "The person who killed the queen is still here." She thought of Vivian's amber eyes, watching the nursery wing with an intensity that went beyond jealousy. And she thought of something Hadley had told her just 2 days ago, his voice barely above a whisper, his red ears burning with the effort of confession. Lady Vivian served the queen her evening tea every night. Every single night. She said it was an act of devotion. No one thought anything of it. Evening tea. A cup. A figure with sharp, angular hair standing over a table. Maisie pressed her back against the nursery wall and closed her eyes. She was an Omega with no power, no allies, no evidence beyond a child's charcoal drawing. If she accused a high-born Beta of murder, the murder of the queen, no less. Without proof, she would be destroyed. Not metaphorically, literally. But if she stayed silent, the killer remained beside the throne. Beside the children. She needed to tell someone. She needed to tell Kaylin. The thought terrified her more than the accusation itself. She found her moment 3 nights later. Kaylin had begun visiting the nursery with a regularity that he clearly believed was unpredictable. Every second or third night, long after the children were asleep, the door would open and he would stand in the threshold, watching. Sometimes he entered. Sometimes he simply looked, confirmed they were breathing, and withdrew. On the nights he entered, he moved through the room like a man navigating a field of buried blades, every step measured, every glance controlled, every emotion locked behind walls of iron discipline. But the walls were thinning. Maisie could see it. On this particular night, he entered and sat, for the first time, in the second wooden chair, the one across from Maisie's, on the far side of the hearth. The fire was between them, casting his features in shifting gold and shadow. He looked exhausted. Not the exhaustion of physical labor, but the deeper kind. The weariness of a man carrying a weight he could not set down and could not share. Rowan built a fire today, Maisie said. By himself. He was very proud. Kaylin's eyes moved to his son's sleeping form. Something crossed his face, too fast to name, too raw to hide. Nessa taught him to do that, he said quietly. He told me. Silence. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, the wind moaned against the walls. My lord, Maisie began, and the steadiness of her own voice surprised her. I need to show you something. She pulled the folded parchment from her pocket and held it out. Kaylin took it. She watched his face as he unfolded it, watched the confusion give way to stillness, the stillness give way to something terrible. He stared at the drawing. His jaw worked. His hands, those broad, scarred hands, gripped the edges of the parchment so tightly that it crumpled. Ilara drew this, Maisie said. I found it under her pillow. I know what it is. His voice was barely human, low, guttural, vibrating with the effort of containment. I know what it shows. Do you know who it shows? Kaylin's gold eyes lifted from the parchment and fixed on her. The wolf was right there, right at the surface, burning through the dark of his irises like fire through smoke. Say it. I cannot be certain, but there are things I've been told. Things about who served the queen her tea, who had access to her chambers, who wanted the position of guardian after she died. Maisie held his gaze. Vivian Hale. The name dropped into the silence like a blade into water. Kaylin did not flinch. He did not react at all, and that absence of reaction was more frightening than any explosion would have been. I have suspected, he said finally. Each word was a controlled detonation. For 2 years I have suspected. But suspicion is not proof, and Vivian's family has served the Voss line for 6 generations. To accuse her without evidence would fracture the pack. Civil war, blood, more death. He looked down at the drawing. A child's picture is not evidence. It is a beginning, Maisie said. Kaylin looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not softening, not yet, but opening. A door left ajar in a fortress that had been sealed shut. You have been here less than 2 months. You are an Omega with no standing, no protection, and no reason to involve yourself in this. Why? Maisie considered lying, considered offering something noble about justice or duty or the protection of innocence, but she was sitting in firelight across from a man who could hear a lie in a heartbeat, and she found that she did not want to lie to him. Because Ilara holds my hand every night, she said. Because Rowan asks me if fire is a gift from the old wolves, because someone killed their mother and is still walking free. And those children deserve better than a world where that is acceptable. Kaylin stared at her. The fire popped. A log shifted, sending sparks spiraling upward like fleeing stars. You are either going to save this house, he said slowly, or you are going to burn it to the ground. Perhaps both, Maisie said. For the first time since she had known him, for the first time, she suspected, in 2 years, the Alpha King almost smiled. Chapter 7. The Trap. Brennan was the first to be told. The war captain listened to Maisie's account in the arming room, A cold stone chamber hung with swords and shields that gleamed dully in the torchlight. His face betrayed nothing throughout. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. "The tea," he said finally. "I should have seen it." She brought it every night. She was the last one with the queen before symptoms began, every time. His copper eyes closed briefly. Not in grief, but in the particular fury of a soldier who has failed his most important charge. "I should have seen it. You see it now," Maisie said. "That is what matters." Brennan opened his eyes and studied her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Respect, perhaps, grudging, reluctant, but genuine. "The drawing alone proves nothing," he said. "But it tells us the child saw something. And if the child saw something, there may be physical evidence we missed. The Queen's chambers have been sealed since her death. The King ordered it. No one has entered in 2 years." "Then we need to enter," Maisie said. Brennan raised an eyebrow. "We?" "You and I. Dorothea, if she can be trusted. The fewer people who know, the safer the children are." The war captain regarded her for another long moment. Then he nodded, once, sharply. "I will speak with the king. If he agrees, we move tomorrow night." He paused at the door. "You understand the danger. If Vivian learns she is suspected, she will act. People who kill once rarely hesitate to kill again." "I understand." "Then stay close to the children. Do not leave them unattended. And do not, under any circumstance, eat or drink anything that Vivian or her servants bring to the nursery wing." He left. Maisie stood alone among the swords and shields and felt the weight of what she had set in motion settle onto her shoulders like a cloak made of iron. The sealed chamber was on the 3rd floor of the royal wing, behind a door of dark oak reinforced with iron bands. 2 guards stood watch. They had stood watch for 2 years, an endless rotation of sentinels guarding a dead woman's room. Kaelin dismissed them with a word and a look that left no room for questions. He opened the door himself. The key was on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, resting against his chest. He had carried it for 2 years, Maisie realized, against his skin, against his heart. The chamber was large and cold and perfectly preserved. Dust lay on every surface like gray snow. The bed was made, the furs smooth, the pillows undented, as if the woman who had slept there had simply risen one morning and never returned. A wooden cradle stood in the corner, draped in white linen now yellowed with age. 2 cradles, Maisie corrected herself. Twins. The smell hit her first. Beneath the dust and the cold, there was something else. Faint, almost imperceptible, but present. A bitter herbal sharpness that clung to the air like a stain. Brennan smelled it too. His nostrils flared, and his eyes snapped to the far corner of the room where a small table stood beneath the window. On the table sat a porcelain tea set. A pot, a cup, a saucer, a small jar. All untouched. All exactly as they had been left on the night the Queen died. Maisie crossed to the table. She did not touch anything. She leaned close to the jar and inhaled carefully. The bitterness was concentrated here. Sharp, acrid, nothing like any tea herb she knew. "Nightwell root," Brennan said from behind her. His voice was flat, controlled, dangerous. "It grows in the southern marshes. Tasteless in small doses, undetectable by scent unless concentrated. In large or repeated doses, it attacks the blood. Slowly, over weeks." Kaelin stood in the doorway. He had not entered the room. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes were burning. "She kept the jar," Maisie said softly. "All this time the evidence has been here, sealed behind this door." "Because no one looked," Kaelin said. His voice was a ruin. "Because I sealed this room the day she died and I could not bring myself to open it again." Brennan picked up the jar with a cloth, careful not to touch it with bare skin. He examined it, turned it in the torchlight. On the bottom, scratched into the porcelain with a thin blade, were 2 initials. VH. The room was silent. The dust settled, and something that had been buried for 2 years rose to the surface at last. They moved at dawn. Maisie had not slept. She had spent the night in the nursery with Rowan curled against her side. and Alara's hand wrapped around her fingers, listening to the wind howl against the shutters, and thinking about what morning would bring. The fire burned low. The shadows gathered in the corners like witnesses waiting to be called. Kaelin had given the order in the arming room just before midnight, his voice stripped of everything but command. Brennan would assemble 6 of his most trusted wolves, men and women who had served under him since before the Queen's death, whose loyalty was rooted in blood and bone rather than politics. Dorothea would secure the household staff in the Great Hall under the pretense of a winter supply inspection. No one in or out until the matter was resolved, and Vivienne would be summoned to the throne room. Maisie was not supposed to be there. Kaelin had been explicit about that. You stay with the children. You lock the nursery door. You do not open it for anyone except Brennan or myself. She had agreed. She had meant it. But when morning came and the castle stirred to life around her, the clatter of boots in the corridors, the bark of orders, the low rumble of wolves preparing for something they did not fully understand, Maisie found herself standing at the nursery window, watching the courtyard below and feeling a pull in her chest that had nothing to do with obedience. Hadley appeared at the stairway table earlier than usual, his face pale. "They've called everyone to the Great Hall," he whispered. "Lady Dorothea is blocking the doors. Something is happening. Take the children's breakfast tray," Maisie said. "Then go to the hall with the others. Stay there." "But what about Hadley?" She met his eyes. "Trust me. Go." He went. Maisie carried the tray upstairs, fed the children, and settled Rowan with his wooden soldiers, and Alara with her charcoal and parchment. Then she locked the nursery door from the inside and sat down in her chair. She waited. The throne room of Ashenmore was built for intimidation. It occupied the full height of the central keep, 3 stories of black granite rising to a vaulted ceiling, supported by pillars carved in the shape of wolves standing on their hind legs, jaws open, eyes fixed on whoever stood below. The throne itself was iron and oak, unpadded, unadorned, set upon a raised platform of dark stone. Torches lined the walls, their flames casting long shadows that moved like restless spirits. Kaelin sat on the throne. He wore black, a leather tunic over chainmail, heavy boots, his dark hair pulled back from his face. No crown. The crown of Ashenmore had not been worn since Nessa's death. He did not need it. His presence filled the room like smoke fills a closed chamber. Heavy, inescapable, pressing against the walls. Brennan stood to his right, armed, his gray wolf barely contained beneath his skin. His copper eyes swept the room in continuous arcs, tracking every movement, every breath. Dorothea stood to the left of the throne, rigid as a pillar, her hands clasped before her. Her face betrayed nothing, but her knuckles were white. The doors opened. 2 guards escorted Vivienne Hale into the room. She entered with the composure of a woman who had been expecting this moment for longer than anyone knew. Her wheat gold hair was braided and coiled at the nape of her neck. She wore a dark green dress with silver embroidery at the sleeves, elegant, understated, chosen with care. Her amber eyes moved from Kaelin to Brennan to Dorothea and back again, reading the room the way a general reads a battlefield. "My king," she said, and her voice was steady, warm, even, the practiced warmth of someone who had spent years perfecting the performance of loyalty. "I was told my presence was required. How may I serve?" Kaelin did not speak immediately. He let the silence build, a technique Maisie would have recognized. The silence of a predator measuring the distance to its prey. Then he raised one hand, and Brennan stepped forward. The war captain placed the porcelain jar on a wooden table that had been set before the throne. The sound of it, small, delicate, final, echoed in the vaulted chamber. Vivienne looked at the jar, and for the first time, something moved behind her amber eyes. A flicker, a fracture in the glass. "Do you recognize this?" Kaelin asked. His voice was quiet, terrifyingly quiet. "I do not, my king. It was found in the Queen's sealed chambers, on the table where her evening tea was served. The tea that you, and only you, prepared and delivered every night for the last 3 months of her life." He paused. "It contains nightwell root, enough to kill slowly, over weeks. Enough to make it look like illness. Vivian's expression did not change. But her hands, clasped before her in a mirror of Dorothea's posture, tightened. I have no knowledge of any poison. I served the queen with devotion. Everyone in this castle can attest to that. The jar bears your initials, Brennan said. Scratched into the base, VH. Another flicker. Vivian's chin lifted. Anyone could have marked that jar. This is not proof. This is suspicion dressed in ceremony. Then let us add to the evidence, Kaelin said. He leaned forward on the throne, slowly, deliberately, like a wolf lowering its head before a charge. 2 years ago, you petitioned to become guardian of my children. When the nursery staff was appointed by others, you placed yourself beside the queen instead. You controlled her meals, her schedule, her isolation from the rest of the household. When she grew ill, you were the one who told the healers it was exhaustion from the pregnancy. You delayed their examination by 3 days. By the time they understood what was happening, the damage was beyond repair. Vivian's composure held, but barely. A muscle jumped in her jaw. I was trying to protect her. She was fragile after the birth. I was her closest. You were her killer. Kaelin's voice did not rise. It dropped. It fell to a register that was more wolf than man, a sound that vibrated in the stones and the bones and the very air of the room. You poisoned my mate. You took her from me, from our children. You sat beside her bed and watched her die, and then you wept at her funeral and offered to raise the children you had orphaned. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the torch flames seemed to still. Vivian stared at him, and then, slowly, like a mask being deliberately removed. Her expression changed. The warmth drained away. The practiced devotion evaporated. What remained was something cold and hard and ancient, a hatred that had been buried so deep and carried so long that it had become the foundation upon which everything else was built. She did not deserve you, Vivian said. Her voice was different now, raw, stripped, the real voice beneath the performance. A southern-born Omega with no bloodline, no strength, no understanding of what this house required. She weakened you. She made you soft. The Voss line needed steel, and she gave you flowers and lullabies and children who cry in the dark. Her amber eyes blazed. I loved this house before she ever set foot in it. I would have been worthy of this throne. I would have made you what you were meant to be. Dorothea made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, quickly controlled. Brennan's hand moved to the sword at his hip. Kaelin rose from the throne. The movement was slow, controlled, carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every unanswered question, every moment he had stood outside his children's door unable to enter because the grief was too vast to navigate. You speak of worth, he said, while confessing to the murder of the woman I loved. You speak of strength while admitting you used poison, the weapon of cowards. You will be taken to the Eastern Tower and held under guard until a tribunal of the allied pacts can convene to hear your crimes. Your family's service to this house is ended. Your name will be struck from the records of Ashenmoor. Vivian lunged, not at Kaelin, at the table, at the jar, desperate to destroy the evidence. Brennan caught her before she had taken 2 steps, his arm locking around her like an iron band. She fought, clawing, snarling, her wolf surging to the surface in a display of fangs and golden eyes. But Brennan held her as if she weighed nothing. Take her, Kaelin said. The guards moved forward. Vivian was pulled from the room, her screams echoing off the vaulted ceiling, bouncing between the stone wolves that watch from the pillars with their eternal, silent judgment. The doors closed. Kaelin stood alone on the platform. His hands hung at his sides. His chest rose and fell with the slow, deliberate breathing of a man holding himself together by the thinnest of threads. Dorothea approached him. She placed one hand on his arm. The first time Maisie would later learn that anyone had touched the king in 2 years, and said quietly, "It is done, Kaelin. It is finally done." He did not respond. He turned and walked out of the throne room through the private entrance behind the dais, and the sound of his footsteps faded into the stone. Epilogue. What grows from ash. Spring came to Ashenmoor like a held breath finally released. The snow retreated from the courtyard first, revealing the cracked flagstones and the roots of the apple tree, which had survived the winter, and now bore the faintest haze of green at the tips of its branches. The mist lifted from the mountains, the rivers thawed, and the light, thin, pale, tentative, returned to the northern territories like a traveler who had been gone too long and was not sure of their welcome. 3 months had passed since Vivian's arrest. The tribunal had convened in the Great Hall, representatives from 5 allied packs, seated at a long oak table, listening to evidence presented by Brennan with the methodical precision of a man who had spent every waking moment since that night building a case that could not be broken. The Nightwell route, the jar with its initials, the testimony of 3 servants who, freed from Vivian's influence, admitted they had seen her preparing separate tea blends in the lower kitchen late at night. The healer who confirmed that the Queen's symptoms were consistent with slow Nightwell poisoning. The verdict was unanimous. Vivian was sentenced to permanent exile beyond the border territories. Her wolf bond severed by the pack elders in a ceremony Maisie did not attend and did not ask about. The Hale family withdrew from Ashenmore in silence, their 6 generations of service erased from the great ledger that hung in the entrance hall. The castle breathed again. Rowan was the first to bloom. He was 5 now, taller, his dark hair forever falling in his eyes, his voice carrying across the courtyard, with the authority of a boy who had decided the world was, on balance, a place worth engaging with. He had graduated from wooden soldiers to wooden swords, and Brennan, stern, granite-faced Brennan, had begun teaching him basic footwork on the afternoons when the weather permitted. The war captain showed no special tenderness, gave no praise that was not earned, and treated the boy with the same exacting standards he applied to his soldiers. Rowan adored him with the uncomplicated worship of a child who has found an adult worth impressing. Alara spoke on a Tuesday. Maisie was sitting beneath the apple tree, which had produced its first blossoms, small, white, fragile as paper, watching Rowan attempt to disarm an imaginary opponent. Alara was beside her, drawing. The charcoal moved across the parchment in confident strokes. She had improved remarkably. Her trees now looked like trees, her wolves like wolves, her people like people with faces and expressions and hands that held things. The drawing she was working on showed 2 figures, a woman with dark auburn hair sitting beneath a tree, a smaller figure beside her, leaning against the woman's arm. Alara set down the charcoal. She looked at the drawing. Then she looked at Maisie. "Mama," she said. The word was quiet, rough, the voice of someone using an instrument they had not touched in 2 years, unsure if it still worked, afraid of what would happen when it did. Maisie went very still, her vision blurred. She blinked, and tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "Yes, sweetheart," she managed. Alara pointed at the drawing, at the woman beneath the tree. Then she looked at Maisie again, and her gray eyes held a question that was so large and so simple that it contained everything. "You stay?" Maisie pulled the girl into her arms and held her. She held her the way she had wanted to hold her since that first night, completely, without reservation, without the fear that this small, precious thing would be taken away. Alara's arms went around her neck, and the child pressed her face into Maisie's shoulder, and the sound she made was not crying. It was release. The opening of a door that had been locked for 2 years. "I stay," Maisie whispered. "I stay." Kalen found them there an hour later. He had changed in the months since Vivian's arrest. Not dramatically, not in the ways that stories prefer, with sudden transformations and grand declarations. The change was quieter. He ate meals in the nursery now, sitting at the small table while Rowan talked endlessly, and Alara drew and Maisie served stew from the iron pot she had convinced the kitchen to let her keep in the upper corridor. He did not say much, but he was present, and his presence was different. Less shadow, less weight, less of the suffocating pressure of a man holding his grief like a weapon. He had touched Rowan's hair for the first time a month ago. A single, brief gesture, his hand resting on his son's dark head for 3 heartbeats before withdrawing. Rowan had looked up at him with an expression of such startled, radiant joy that Brennan, standing in the doorway, had turned away and found something urgent to inspect on the opposite wall. Now Kalen stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching Maisie hold his daughter beneath the blossoming apple tree. And something in his face, the last fortification, the final wall, came down. He crossed the courtyard. He knelt on the cold flagstones beside them. Alara lifted her head from Maisie's shoulder and looked at her father, and for the first time in 2 years, she reached for him. Kalen took his daughter in his arms. He held her against his chest, one broad hand cradling the back of her head, and closed his eyes. His shoulders shook once, twice, then stilled. Rowan appeared from nowhere, as children do, and threw himself into the arrangement with the subtlety of a small battering ram, wrapping his arms around his father's leg and pressing his face into his knee. "Papa's hugging," he announced to no one in particular, as if documenting a historical event. "Papa's actually hugging." And Maisie sat on the ground beside them, the apple blossoms drifting down like white snow, and watched the Alpha King hold his children for the first time since their mother died. She did not touch him. She did not need to. The space between them was not empty. It was full of something growing, something that had no name yet but carried the weight of possibility. Kalen opened his eyes and looked at her over Alara's dark head. His gaze was steady, clear, stripped of armor. What she saw in it was not a declaration. It was a question. The same question Alara had asked, spoken in a different language, but meaning the same thing. "You stay?" Maisie smiled. It was the first full, unguarded smile she had allowed herself since arriving at Ashenmoor. Since long before that, if she was honest. Since before the debt auction, since before the rope, since before she had learned that the world measured her worth in silver coins. "I stay," she said. Kalen reached across the space between them. His hand found hers, rough, scarred, trembling slightly, and held on. Not with the desperate grip of a drowning man, but with the careful, deliberate pressure of someone choosing to hold something fragile and deciding, for the first time in years, not to let go. Above them, the apple tree bloomed. The courtyard filled with pale spring light. Rowan began explaining to Alara his detailed plans for an assault on the East Tower's hawk nests. Brennan appeared in the doorway, saw the scene, and retreated with a softness in his copper eyes that he would deny until his dying day. Dorothea watched from the window above, her hands clasped, her severe face holding an expression she would never allow anyone to name. And Hadley, crossing the courtyard with a tray of bread and cheese and early strawberries, stopped in his tracks, turned bright red to the tips of his ears, and smiled. Ashenmoor had been a house of grief. A house of silence and poison and doors that could not be opened. But grief, like winter, does not last forever. And sometimes the bravest thing in the world is not a sword or a crown or a wolf's howl in the dark. Sometimes it is a pair of bare feet on cold stone stairs, walking toward the sound of children crying, because someone had to come, and someone did.